many jokes? Nope. I mean, you can make jokes about positive punishment. It is what it is. But in order for it to be actual punishment, it has to decrease the future likelihood of behavior. So things that we would make jokes about are probably actually not punishing. All those innuendos, it's good times. All right, so we got positive reinforcement. Can y'all give me an example of positive reinforcement? What behavior? Like, give me. Answering questions in class. Every time you answer a question, I'm like, here's a cookie. All right, negative reinforcement. You just got an example. No. Unless you hate cookies. What negative reinforcement did I just offer you all? A quiz pass for doing the research study. Yeah, that's negative reinforcement. All right, so now we're going to talk about punishment. Mostly today we're going to focus on positive punishment, and your guest lecture on Thursday we'll talk about negative punishment. She's long-winded, as am I, but she's longer-winded than I am, and so she'll probably still talk about both a little bit. Positive punishment, what do we think that is? Jessica, are you raising here?
Yeah.
Yes?
Like if you made us.
Yeah, that's a good one. I wouldn't likely tie it into an academic task, but that is adding an aversive for most people to decrease the likelihood that they'll do something, right? So if you skipped class and then I sent you a quiz link and was like, you have to do this today, that would be positive punishment. So we add something to the environment to decrease the future likelihood that the behavior will occur. And then what would negative punishment be? To what? Is that the word you said the first time? Did you say decrease? Okay, all right. It sounded like it could be increase. All right, yes. So we take something away to decrease the future likelihood behavior will occur. Can you give me an example of negative punishment?
Like when you ground your kid?
Yes. Yes, when you ground your kid from all the things. Yeah, take away the iPad, you ground them, or you take away their car keys, they can't drive. All things like that are considered negative punishment. All right, so the key difference between punishment and reinforcement, they are both a stimulus change, but the difference here is that punishment will decrease the future probability of a response it immediately follows. So thinking through this, if we learned everything we did about reinforcement and reinforcement schedules and all that good stuff, what do you think that would imply for punishment? Should we do it intermittently like we do with reinforcement? All the time. What do we mean by all the time? 100% of the time. Yeah. Because if we don't punish one time out of 100, what is that called? Is that called punishment? Or is it called intermittent reinforcement? So the challenge with punishment for behavior change is that you have to do it 100% of the time in order for it to fully work. So think about that with like, if you get a speeding ticket for speeding, you might go the speed limit for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And then gradually, as you get further away from the cop, you start to increase your speed again. So as long as you don't see a police officer, you're likely to engage in the behavior again, right? So we have to punish behavior 100% of the time for it to fully go away. Otherwise, it's called intermittent reinforcement. All right. So with positive punishment, when we're adding something to the environment to decrease the future likelihood of behavior, this one is the one that, think about pain, ouch, right? If there is a hot stove and you touch it and you get burnt, are you likely to touch the stove again in the future? No. So it's not just about like parents inflicting pain, but rather when the environment inflicts pain, assuming that you don't like that pain. Sorry, got to go back to Caitlin's example earlier in her mind about positive punishment.
Yeah, because the test on was like, you stub your toe, don't do it again. I remember it was positive.
Yeah, and stubbing the toe is positive punishment in theory, but you would think that that would mean I would stub.
I get confused.
So the pain, that is adding pain to the environment. So negative reinforcement removes pain. So think about like taking ibuprofen or Tylenol after a headache. So negative reinforcement removes pain. Positive punishment adds pain. But that pain has to be at a level for that individual where it feels painful and they don't like the pain. Sorry. You got to make jokes. So, but also some kids with autism have like really high pain thresholds. And so like, I've had kids break their arm and it take like days for parents to realize that they've broken their arm because they didn't indicate that they were in pain. So pain is definitely an individualized receptor. So some people have higher or lower pain tolerances. We're gonna ask a question, Jessica? No, just whatever. All right, so positive punishment. A stimulus is presented or added, right? Plus sign added, following some behavior, and this produces a decrease in the future occurrences of this behavior. All right. Okay, I split this presentation way too short. So my disclaimer is if it makes you feel uncomfortable, you're free to walk out of the classroom or whatever you need to do. But this is the example of positive punishment on a different scale. So adding shock for problem behavior. This is a real facility in the Northeast. And I'm just going to play it. Some share. Sound sheet. My online people can hear.
Hi, I'm Bob Onheim. I've been working here for about 14 and a half years. I was involved with developing the GED back in 1990. The GED is our contingent skin shock device. As Dr. Rivera has mentioned, we do try positive programming with our clients. We maintain positive programming until we feel the need. We need to supplement it with versus when the positive programming isn't effective enough. You can see in this case, the individual was on positive programming for about 6 months before we decided to move on. During that 6 months, those are all changes in contracts, the DO contracts she was mentioning, many things to try. It goes off the screen, you can't see all the changes that were put in place. Contingent skin shock began when the behaviors went down to 0. To use the verses, we need court approval for each individualized basis. We first get approval from the family to use the aversive procedures. Sending agency also must okay the use of it. We get medical approval, medical, psychiatric, neurological. Each individual person does get court approval also. A clinician will write a treatment plan submitted to the court. Then the court will assign an attorney to represent each student. That attorney then hires a psychiatrist or a psychologist to be their expert. Then we do have a hearing before the judge, and the judge approves or disapproves the use of our treatment plan. And every year we have to review these. The reason we do use versus the JRC is we do get referred some of the most difficult clients from across the country. Brandon, you probably saw him walking around back in 1990. He was the first one approved for GED. One of his behaviors was projectile vomiting. He was down to 52 pounds,
Intentional
hospitalized numerous times
projectile
with
vomiting
dehydration,
to avoid
and really
doing
in danger of losing his life. Graham also would bite off pieces of his tongue. He abused every area of his body. Matthew liked to headbang against the hardest objects he could find. Sean bit the nose off one of our staff members before GD was used. So they are some of the most difficult clients to deal with. The device that we developed, the skin shock device, is called the Graduated Electronic Decelerator, GED. On the left is the stimulator, and the right is a battery. It's activated remotely. The top figure shows the small remote that staff will press to activate it. It's worn in a plexiglass case to avoid any accidental activation. We use two different types of electrodes. The current travels from the button to the ring. It's generally worn on the arm or the leg, so it simulates that area of tissue. It's 2 seconds long. Staff can't control duration or intensity. The distance electrode has the 2 buttons, again, probably one on the arm or the leg, and it just stimulates the surface of the skin. But it is aversive. You probably saw a number of them wearing it in a fanny pack or backpack. The way it's actually used in the classrooms and the residents is a clinician's written an individualized treatment plan that describes the behaviors to be treated, the consequence. For example, in the HDB or health dangerous behaviors, headbanging is a targeted behavior and is targeted with 1 GED application. If the staff see a student headbang, what they need to do is pick up that recording sheet, verify with another staff member that says John Doe. The John Doe's consequence for headbanging is 1 GED. And they need to pick up the remote activator, which has the individual's name and picture on it, and verify that before pinpointing the behavior and applying the GED, the skin shock device. That verification process does take a little bit of time, but it ensures that the program is followed exactly as written. As Dr. mentioned, only 50% of our clients receive aversives, and of that, the average is less than, in April, it was 2 or less per week, with about 36% of those receiving no applications for the month of April. The GED is the skin shock device is highly effective in decreasing targeted behaviors. Juanita was a severe head puncher, and we put her in arm splints to stop that. She started abusing every other area of her body. Her major behaviors were exhibited at a median 4,460 a week before GED treatment was introduced. When the skin shock device went in, there was a 1,000-fold decrease in the frequency of that behavior. So it went down from over 4,000 down to a median of 3 per week, and it's been maintaining at that level. Most of you probably saw her in the classroom downstairs. We've had individuals that receive no applications. They understand the procedure, they don't want it. Stephanie severely attacked staff when she had bad days, and they were very bad days. She said, I'm not going to receive any applications, and she never did. Same with this young lady who put her head through plate glass windows. As soon as the device went on, she stopped. Both these people still call us to come and visit. Very happy they had this treatment. One of the big benefits of using the GED is you can eliminate the need for any restraint. We very rarely, with clients that were using the skin shock, do we rarely have to use any kind of restraint. But you can see in this case, this is Juanita, who was the head puncher. She was in a lot of restraint to keep her safe. All the side effects of the GED are positive. It allows them to pass the contracts, which they previously couldn't pass. We have many people who have graduated with their high school diplomas after starting with GED treatment. Before that, they weren't educated anywhere. The families are our biggest supporters. They're very happy they can sit next to their son or daughter without worrying about them self-abusing or attacking the family. And many individuals get jobs out in the community. We paid the device off, and they're very successful out in the community on their own. So that's brief 5-minute history on aversives. Next, I'd like to introduce Ed Langford, who's going to talk about the charting software and the educational software.
All right. So, who here have we all like solidified in our brains about negative and positive not being good or bad? Is anyone struggling with that still? At all? Very okay. That's like, think about it in a very mathematical way, right?
Positive, we add. Negative, we subtract. Okay. There we go. Okay. So again here, positive and negative, we are presenting something or removing something, adding something or removing something, and reinforcement always tells you behavior increases, always. If reinforcement is done correctly, behavior will always increase, always, 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 always. If it's not increasing, that doesn't mean that reinforcement doesn't work. What does that mean? That means that what you have is not valued enough, right? Like, so the example that I give is, you know, if you've watched 4 hours of Netflix all day, or 5 hours or 6 hours, like you've really binged some Netflix, there's a point at which you're like, I'll still watch this because I don't have anything else to do, or I'm bored, or whatever the case may be, or lazy, or I don't want to do anything, it's raining outside. But at a certain point, we've satiated on it so much that it's probably not reinforcing. It wouldn't change our behavior if someone said, do X, and now you can watch Netflix. You'd be like, meh, I'll go do something else, right? But maybe if you hadn't watched anything on TV for a month, or however valuable, you know, screen time is for you, you might be motivated enough to do some behavior that you wouldn't otherwise do, right? So reinforcement always works, but it has to be valuable. And that is individualized. I can't say that for any of y'all. I cannot determine that for anybody. No one can. And then punishment generally decreases behavior if properly implemented, which is almost impossible, right? So when y'all talked about reinforcement, did y'all talk about intermittent reinforcement? What does that do to behavior? Does behavior get weaker or stronger when it's intermittently reinforced? It gets stronger, right? Intermittent reinforcement makes a behavior more resistant to extinction, meaning it is stronger and it's less likely to be extinguished or to go away, right? This is gambling, right? This is why we gamble, because we keep pulling that slot machine and eventually, hopefully, it'll pay out, right? We keep doing that. Another good way to think about it when we talk about intermittent versus continuous reinforcement, if you've got a brand new car or a relatively new car that's really consistent, right? And it doesn't generally have any issues. When you get in and you engage in the behavior of sticking the key in or pushing the button or however your ignition works, and it turns over immediately, right? If it does that every single time, that's continuous reinforcement, right? If it does that every single time, and then you get in it one day and it's like, burr, 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 you're like, this is not normal. This probably is something is wrong. You might push it one more time, maybe a third time, but then it'll go completely flat, right? Because you've really exhausted your battery or whatever the problem is. And then you give up, you're done. Versus if you have an inconsistent vehicle that, like, you know, you got to crank it a couple of times because you don't get that reinforcement every single time. There's intermittent reinforcement at play. You're going to keep cranking it until it turns over, right? So those are kind of the ways to think about that. Well, what happens if we don't provide punishment every time the behavior occurs? Intermittent reinforcement, right? That's why we speed in the city of Memphis, because intermittently it's reinforced and intermittently it's punished, right? So it's not effective because we're going to keep gambling. And I think that if I go 70 down San Cooper today, I'm probably not going to get stopped, right? So just remembering that, again, the reason punishment doesn't work is because it's almost impossible to present a punisher every instance of behavior. The second you stop, we usually see a resurgence of that behavior. Okay. So negative punishment, a stimulus is removed, right? Negative tells us that we take something away following some behavior, and this produces a decrease in the future occurrences of that behavior. So generally speaking, when we think of positive and negative reinforcement and punishment, positive reinforcement, we add something preferred. Negative reinforcement, we take away something non-preferred. Positive punishment, we add something non-preferred. Negative punishment, we're taking away something preferred, right? This is speeding ticket, right? They take away your money, right? Usually you have to pay a fine. I will say, generally speaking, the most common use of, aside from fines that you get from the government or taxes or whatever the case may be. But the most common daily use of punishment is timeout. Whether that be, I'm taking away your screen time today. I'm putting you on, my child has a timeout step. Sit on this step and have a break from everything and me most often. That's funny. Traffic fines. I didn't even know that was on there. Traffic fines doubled in work zones. Can anybody else think of other types of negative punishment? Don't be scared. So the removal of something preferred.
Sorry, guys. Anyway, grounding some their video games.
Yeah. Yeah. So for older kids, the timeout for older kids is you're grounded, right? You can't go out with your friends. You can't do all the fun things and you got to do extra chores. Which would be, if you had to do extra chores, what would that be? Positive punishment. So I have reviewed these and we're going to probably beat this a little bit like a dead horse. So just so everyone's prepared. When she told me, she was like, it's negative punishment. I was like, an hour and a half on negative punishment, just negative. Okay. Good thing I'm long-winded. So stimulus is removed, right? Usually a preferred stimulus. It would have to be preferred because if a non-preferred stimulus would be removed, that would be what? What kind of?
Reinforcement,
What kind of reinforcement?
negative.
Yeah. I'm not going to butcher your name. Jasmine?
Yeah, that's right.
I didn't butcher it. So a non or preferred stimulus is generally removed following some behavior, and this produces a decrease in the future occurrences of behavior. So one thing to really remember is there's a difference between stopping a behavior now versus stopping the future occurrence of behavior, right? We have lots. So there is a type of therapy, and this will be a little bit of a controversial statement, just so everyone knows. Not super controversial, not triggering by, or at least I would called sensory integration therapy. And that is usually implemented by occupational therapists. And when implemented properly, can be very, very effective. But sometimes what I see is, a child is having a maladaptive behavior. And what I'm going to go over to do is I'm going to give them a lot of sensory input. I'm going to give them squeezes, some brushing, some different sensory input techniques. And that stops the behavior right then, calms them down, right? Think about when we're really stressed and frustrated and somebody gives you a tight hug, sometimes it helps us calm down, right? Or, somebody comes over and massages your shoulders, it makes you think of something different and it helps you calm down. It stops that behavior in the moment, but is that going to stop the behavior going forward? Probably not, because that reinforces the behavior, right? It's preferred, it feels good. So what oftentimes we see is if we implement something like sensory integration therapy in the middle of a challenging behavior, we'll see an increase overall instead of a decrease overall, right? And so the difference being the sensory integration therapy should be provided and prescribed during times without maladaptive behavior as what we call an antecedent intervention, so that it prevents the behavior from occurring. It regulates their sensory inputs before they start getting overstimulated and engage in maladaptive behavior. Does that make sense? Oh, Lord. So following a behavior, right? It has to happen after the behavior occurs. Following a behavior. So it has to happen after the behavior occurs. And like I said, it decreases those future occurrences or the future frequency of behavior. Oh, I hope they were able to see the screen all this time. I'm not in IT. So discriminative effects of punishment. So we know what an SD is, right? Everyone know what an SD is? Somebody tell me what an SD is. Not this, something that is not on the board right now. This would be something y'all hopefully have already talked about. Huh? A little bit. So an SD It stands for discriminative stimulus. I feel like you might know, but you're nervous to say it. Tell me. What does it signal? Do we know what it signals? Okay. So an SD signals that reinforcement will be available upon a correct response. So I say, I don't know any of y'all's names. Clap your hands. She claps her hands and I say, yeah, good job, or whatever is reinforcing for her, right? And over time, she learns that because when I say clap hands to her or whatever demand or SD that we're providing, that reinforcement will follow, right? There's certain things in all of our lives that we know that we have been conditioned, if you will, that when someone presents some sort of statement or demand or even engages in some sort of physical response, that if I engage in X behavior, that it will result in reinforcement, right? You know, a husband that brings home flowers and chocolate might be an SD for sex later, right? Like, you know, if I do certain things, reinforcement will follow, right? That would be a little bit more convoluted than as simple as you think it is. But the bell is more of what we call a warning stimulus, which I'm sure y'all have not gone over yet. But I would say it almost would be more of an SDP, that like if you don't get up, I don't know, that one's a little bit tricky. I'd have to like map it. Because if you didn't get up, there'd probably be some punishment, right? The next teacher would come in and be like, why are you still in my class? Versus, I mean, I guess maybe the reinforcement would be like the teacher being excited that you showed up to the next class. I don't know. Or going home. Yeah, I mean, that one you would kind of have to map out. And I will say there are some examples where it's hard to parse out, like, so if it's cold in the classroom, you're really cold, and you change the temperature, is that positive reinforcement, as in warm air is coming, or negative reinforcement as cold air has gone away? Right. So there's some examples that you're like, kind of go both ways. Oh, that's definitely, I would say like, thank you is so there would be some SD to thank you, right? Something would have happened that was pleasing, and you say thank you, and then the you're welcome is the reinforcement, right? And then the thank you would be the SD for someone saying you're welcome, and then usually there's like a smile or some sort of like social reinforcement, you know, like, oh, you're so cool because we said thank you and you're welcome, we're nice to each other. So the behavior isn't linear. It literally is cyclical. Like it will continue on and on and on. If you're analyzing that's what I was saying. You have to analyze each tiny little component of it to really see, is this positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment? So that is far more than y'all signed up for today. So an SDP, a stimulus condition in the presence of which a response has a lower probability of occurrence than it does in its absence as a result of response contingent punishment delivery on the presence of the stimulus. A lot of words, y'all. It's a lot of words. Basically, it's telling you that if this SD is delivered, you know that the behavior is less likely to occur. Otherwise, a punisher will follow. Does that make sense? So an SD signals reinforcement will follow, and SDP signals punishment will follow, right? It could be, you know, you're speeding and all of a sudden you hear whoop, whoop, and the lights, right? That's your SDP that punishment is about to follow. And that SDP in and of itself could potentially become punisher as well. So some examples: grandma's in the kitchen before dinner, you reach into the cookie jar, and then grandma says, no cookies before dinner. You're going to spoil your dinner. Seagulls are present at the beach. You leave the sandwich unattended, they swoop down and take off with your sandwich, right? Those are the SDPs, right? I usually would put B there, but I'll tell Sarah that then. Okay, so recovery from punishment. This is what we were talking about earlier. Punishment, yeah, go ahead. No, go for it. It's gonna make this class go as long as it probably should.
Can you restate how you stated the last definition of?
Yeah, so an SDP,
Yes.
it's basically a discriminative stimulus for punishment. Means that if an SDP is present, yeah. So if an SDP is present, so like if you go into the kitchen and you're like, I want a cookie, I'm gonna try to sneak one before dinner, and you see that grandma's there, there's a lower probability of reaching into the candy jar or the cookie jar because you're gonna get scolded, right? So it means that if this SDP, if there's this presence of a discriminative stimulus that indicates, and y'all know what I mean when I say discriminative stimulus? Yes, no, are there, okay. So it's like a really long way to say that there is some stimulus, right? And a stimulus is literally everything in the environment, like the words coming out of my mouth are auditory stimuli. You know, we have tactile stimuli, things that we taste are stimuli, things that we hear are stimuli, all the things, everything in the environment is a stimulus, right? And so don't just think like, a lot of people think like a stimulus has to be some sort of concrete physical thing, and it does not have to be. And that stimulus you have learned over time that there's something to discriminate around that stimulus, right? So we talk about discriminating, you know, this is a phone and this is a remote, right? We can discriminate between those two things, right? And the true discriminative stimulus, the signal that, like I said, signals reinforcement is coming. An SDP signals that punishment will follow, right? So this stimulus, so my phone ringing and with the sight of my favorite person, me answering it, is a SD that if I answer it, if I engage in the behavior of answering the phone, reinforcement will follow. I get to talk to the person that I really like. If the phone rings and it's my mom, who I love dearly, but sometimes don't want to talk to, if I answer it, that's an SDP for punishment might follow because she's not always the most positive person. This is being recorded, so no one sent it to her. So going into the kitchen, grandma's there, tells you if I reach into that candy jar, that cookie jar, probably going to get my hand slapped or I might get yelled at or something like that. If there are a bunch of birds on the beach, don't leave your food unattended because it's likely going to get eaten. Those are the SDPs. Does that make more sense? Okay. Yeah.
The SDP signal for punishment will follow. I mean, the SDP signal for positive punishment.
SD. So an SD. So just a plain old SD. Hold on a minute. If you don't. So a regular SD versus an SDP. So signals reinforcement will follow. And this signal punishment will follow. Yeah. All right. So recovery from punishment will happen almost every time, unless there are some examples like, you know, if you speed in Pulaski County, it's going to cost you a whole lot of money in a couple of days of your life. If you know, in some countries, if you engage in some what we would consider like minimal, even like slightly, just slightly, or even not even criminal behavior in this country, you might get your hand chopped off. Like that might make me have a pause to not do something, right? But then again, we're talking about some ethical concerns. So the other part of it is when it's not that extreme, it has to happen every single time. So if it's discontinued, those suppressive effects means that you will likely see a recovery from punishment, that those effects are not permanent. Sometimes the rate of responding after punishment is discontinued will not only recover, the rate of responding after punishment will not only recover, but also briefly exceed the level at which it was occurring prior to punishment. We kind of test the waters, right? Like, what can I get away with? Permanent response suppression may occur when complete suppression of behavior to a zero rate of responding has been achieved with intense punishment, really, really severe. Again, like I said, generally some serious human rights or ethical concerns when it's that intense or that severe. Any questions on any of this? Anybody think that this is wrong? I'm open for debate. No? Anybody feel like they've experienced punishment that was effective? Can you give an example?
So I think it's more of a like,
Just try.
basically my brother would always get spanked or one time he was slapped somebody's tooth. It was already loose. But he would always get in trouble first, and so I would see that it sounds like reinforcement, I would say it, but I would see him getting in trouble, and that would stop me from doing bad things.
I would say that's not reinforcement. That would be an SDP for you engaging in that behavior, right? Him getting in trouble is the signal that if I don't stop, I'm gonna get slapped too, right? Anybody else? Intense punishment, right? Well, yeah. Those are some natural consequences, and that actually wouldn't be considered punishment. So punishment and reinforcement in these conditions generally have to be what we call socially mediated, which means involving other people. That would be an automatic response to, it might be more like what we would consider respondent conditioning, right? This reflex or response that was uncontrolled by you, that is the consequence of consuming crab. Again, a little tricky. You could probably argue it a couple of different ways. Mhm. Right. Well, also it depends on like how intense is the risk. Is it like I just get a little bit itchy, or like the roof of my mouth? I have a friend who's allergic to apples, but she'll still eat them occasionally. It just makes the roof of her mouth itch, and she just sucks it up and deals with it, I guess, because the reinforcing effectiveness of apples clearly is more valued than the punishing consequences of the itchy roof of her mouth, right? When you are talking through behavior analysis and really starting to understand it, the best way to really think through all the things is the value, right? What is the value of the punishment versus the value of the reinforcement? So speeding in Memphis, the value of the reinforcement is likely greater than the value of the punishment because the punishment is so intermittent and relatively minimal, right? It'll take 5 or 10 minutes of your time today and a couple hours of your time in the future if I get caught, versus I'll get to my next location 10 minutes early today. So those things are not balanced, and for punishment to work, the value of the punishment has to far exceed the value of the reinforcement. Like the value of punishment for me for driving through Pulaski County is far greater than me getting back to Kalamazoo, Michigan with any excessive, speediness. Oh yeah. I was also really upset about it because there were a couple of people in the court that also were there for speeding tickets who got theirs dismissed because of their particular line of work. And I was like, I work with children with autism, and that should say something. What does that mean for me? Nothing. It meant nothing. I still had to pay $685. Yeah.
I drove through Illinois. I
It was probably Pulaski County.
Probably when I was driving to Chicago.
Yep.
Yeah, and I was like, I drove up in my, so it was like, I was like 7 hours into an 8-hour drive by myself in the car. And I'm going through and I like saw some orange signs maybe, but I was getting, merging and then I was driving and everything was a blur at that point because it had been 7 hours. Inside of my head. And I looked at my phone and it said 70 on it, like as the speed limit. So I was like, all right, keep going. So I kept going. 70, 75. They're there. And there's a cop behind me. And I'm like, that's weird. And we keep going. And then after a while, he puts the lights on, he pulls me over. He's like, that's 55. I was like, ooh.
No bueno.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Can we have a conversation about that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, and this cop that pulled me over had mercy on no one. It was like, I'm gonna get as many of y'all today as I can. Yeah.
Sometimes it's not really a quota, but it's just like,
Yeah.
and it could have been. I didn't want to just you on the road, and I'm like, okay, there's no one here but true, I'm not gonna hit anything.
Okay, punishers. So we've got unconditioned punishers and conditioned punishers, or sometimes also called unlearned and learned, right? So unconditioned or unlearned means that you don't have to learn. You didn't have to be conditioned for this to have punishing value. Generally, it's pain, right? So pain, deprivation of food and water, deprivation of sleep. We're going to talk about conditioned and unconditioned reinforcers. Y'all recall? I would be shocked that if she had this slide here and didn't have it in the last ones. Who can tell me what the unlearned or unconditioned reinforcers are? There are 4 of them.
Oh, is that the one? Attention.
No, those are the functions of behavior. So food, it's things you need to survive and for the survival of a species, right? So food, water, sex, and sleep. Sleep is sometimes debatable. It's for the species to survive.
I have the same thought as myself.
Yeah. Do we need sex in our lives? No. But if we want for the humans to live on, then sure. You start that. You touch that theory and let me know how it goes. So unconditioned punishers in the same vein are things that we don't have to learn or punishing, right? Generally speaking, most everyone, pain is punishing to most people. There are some people that enjoy some degree of pain in certain circumstances, but generally speaking, pain. Like I said, deprivation of food, water, probably light deprivation would be punishing at some point in time. That wouldn't necessarily be conditioned because I think we need vitamin D to live. Then conditioned punishers are those punishers that have learned properties that we have learned over time because they were paired with other punishers that were unconditioned. So who here has like a weird thing that's like super punishing that was obviously learned for them that like wouldn't be considered unconditioned? Cleaning your room, probably. Yep. For me, it's like the sound of styrofoam. I can't handle it, or the feeling of like raw cotton. I like cringes my spine. Yeah, I can't. I'm like when I get a new pill bottle, I'm like, send somebody else and do that cotton out for me. Yeah, it's bad. Sorry. I will say this building for a while for me was a punisher because when I was in undergrad, they had a massive rat lab, and when they were done with the rats, there was an incinerator and it smelled like that in the whole building, and I'd come in very frequently and vomit. So just coming into this building when I was in college was like, oh God, let me take some deep breaths and not breathe for a while. Yeah. Anything else? Anybody else? My friends over here who haven't spoken much or back there? Anything that y'all can think of that is punishing for you that might not be punishing for other people?
Think of work against another one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It just comes into my ears, but I just cover my.
Yeah.
eyes all the time.
Either one of you friends? Oh, yeah. What about you? There's nothing? I don't believe you. You can't think of anything? Say breathing, like hearing people breathe?
Both the feel and sound markers right.
Oh. Interesting. And it would be fun to do like I mean, if you could, that would probably date back really far that you wouldn't remember, but a history of these things. Where was it paired to establish some punishing value? Anybody online have any weird punishers? No? Okay. 1, 2 seconds. Factors that influence the effectiveness of punishment. I do remember she goes down each slide. The immediacy, the maximum suppressive effects are obtained when the onset of the punisher occurs as soon as possible after the occurrence of a target response. Meaning, you have to deliver that punishment quickly in order for it to be the most effective. Same goes for reinforcement. The faster you deliver a reinforcer, the more effective it is. There's actually some research posted out there about smaller sooner versus larger later. Have y'all talked about that ever in any of y'all's classes? No? Smaller sooner versus larger later. The concept that most people prefer smaller sooner than larger later. I'll take 1 marshmallow now versus waiting a day and having 5 tomorrow, or that's like a really arbitrary example, but just kind of the general concept. Hi.
I think we have talked about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just the preference over immediate reinforcement versus delayed reinforcement, right?
Yeah, of course. Yep. Same thing goes with punishment. It's far more effective if it's immediate. The intensity, the more intense the punishing stimulus is, the greater it will reduce future responding. She told me, Dr. Irby told me that she showed you all the videos from the JRC already. We don't need to go into the controversy about the controversial nature of the JRC. I have my own personal opinions, but they probably are not needed today. But those are pretty intensive consequences, right? And because they're more intense, again, we're looking at some ethical concerns. They are generally more effective, right? We see a pretty immediate decrease in problem behavior. Usually, if you have an effective punisher, you'll see problem behavior stop almost immediately. The schedule or frequency. So the greater the proportion of responses that are followed by the punisher, the greater the response reduction. But again, even if 1 response is reinforced, that is intermittent reinforcement. And if the value of that reinforcement is greater than the value of what the punisher is, you're still going to not see consistent reduction in behavior. The availability of reinforcement for the target behavior, to the extent that reinforcement maintaining the problem behavior can be reduced or eliminated, punishment will be more apparent. So, if every time your child screams, you spank them, but you're like, I don't know that I want to do this in Target or the grocery store or at the zoo or, all these places where you might be a little embarrassed or afraid somebody might say something or whatever the case may be, then it's not as available, right? And so you're going to see, again, some of that intermittent reinforcement, which is going to have decreased suppression effects. Yeah, so the availability of reinforcement for the target behavior, the extent that, I did say that wrong. So the extent that the reinforcement maintaining the problem behavior can be reduced or eliminated, punishment will be more apparent. So if, say, So screaming for a candy bar at the grocery store, reinforcement is more available, right? Because I don't want to spank you here. Does that make sense? And so, oh, you're screaming for that candy bar here versus at home, screaming for the candy in the candy jar, you spank them and send to your room, no one's watching and you don't feel so gross about it. Does that make sense? And again, we're really kind of talking about more positive punishment because negative punishment in different settings is really tricky. I mean, unless like, I don't know. I will say I do put my child in timeout in restaurants sometimes, but I just turn the high chair around. You just need to go over there for a minute. And then the availability of reinforcement for the alternative behavior. Suppression effects of punishment can be enhanced by reinforcement for an alternative response. And this is generally what in behavior analysis we should all be doing versus some sort of punishment. So if you're using punishment, even if it's intermittent, which we shouldn't be using punishment generally, because like we said, it doesn't work super well, but this is going to be the most effective way to implement punishment is if you have a child who engages in attention seeking problem behavior and you teach them to appropriately seek attention and you reinforce that appropriate attention seeking behavior with a lot of really strong quality attention. And then when they engage in like the screaming behavior for attention, you spank, right? Like, or whatever, you take away whatever, you put them in timeout, whatever the case may be. That is going to be your most effective way because it's like, oh, I can really discriminate and discern that if I do this, I get really good attention versus if I do this, this sucks, right? Does that make sense to everybody? That's when we start talking about what's called differential reinforcement. Did y'all talk about differential reinforcement yet? Spence, have y'all talked about differential reinforcement yet?
Can you give me some examples?
Differential reinforcement of other behavior, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior, and differential reinforcement of high rates of behavior.
I think so.
Okay.
We've touched on
I've
that.
slept since then. I'm sorry.
So I'm gonna tell Sarah, Dr. Irby, that that lesson on differential reinforcement of different types of behavior was really effective. Obviously kidding. Nope, not so much. Okay. All right. Side effects of punishment. There is emotional responding. It can evoke a variety of different emotional responding. Can evoke aggression. Can evoke all kinds of different things. Crying. Can evoke self-injury. It can evoke property destruction. It can evoke significant elopement, right? Like how many of us growing up when we knew punishment might be coming, we're like, I'm getting out of here. I'm running away. Lasted all of 5 minutes, for me at least. Escape and avoidance, that the elopement, natural reactions to aversive stimulation, right? We want to avoid it. We want to get away from it. Behavioral contrast, change in the contingencies in one setting might lead to changes in a response rates in the opposite direction in another setting. So you might get some suppression effects in the setting where punishment occurs, but we might see increased maladaptive behavior in different settings. Modeling of undesirable behavior. So the child imitates inappropriate behavior. I will tell you, this happens with my child. Every time I spank him, which has not been a lot, I could probably count on one hand in his 2.5 years of life, how many times I've spanked him. And usually because whatever he's doing would cause pain, like jumping down the stairs or trying to jump out of the golf cart or, something that could really hurt him. Usually what happens is he starts hitting me more, like not necessarily in that moment, but like I'll see for the next couple of days, he's hitting more. And I feel like, well, that's because I've definitely modeled that for him. And then abuse and misuse by punishing agent. So the punisher's behavior is negatively reinforced by the cessation of the punished behavior. So the removal of that behavior, right? So that negative reinforcement of like, when I spank you and the behavior stops, man, that felt good because it made it go away. And my behavior of spanking was negatively reinforced. And then we see a cycle of doing it more often when it's often, like I said, not effective. This is also like at the, there's like a cycle of if I do something to make this stop, my behavior will continue even if it doesn't actually stop in the future, right? Like this cycle will perpetuate, like the sensory integration. I'm going to squeeze you to make you stop screaming and shaking, but then you continue to scream and shake in the future because you need those squeezes to calm down. Does that make sense to everybody? And then here are a lot of words that I don't expect y'all to read. It's really small. But this just kind of goes through positive punishment, which I'll talk about earlier this week, Tuesday, right? Okay. So we've got some positive punishment procedures. We've got overcorrection, contingent exercise, guided compliance, or physical restraint. So overcorrection, which I'll talk about all these on Tuesday. Okay. Overcorrection is where you've got a couple of different different variations. So there's just plain old overcorrection, which is like when someone talks out in class in the old Catholic school and they're like, you've got to write, I will not shout in class 100 times. That's just overcorrection, right? That's just arbitrary overcorrection. It's not really related to shouting in class. It's just making you do this like physical thing over and over again. So hopefully reduce shouting in class. Positive practice is where essentially the same thing that I just said, but it is relevant to what you told them to do. So say they had a bunch of toys on the floor, your child had a bunch of toys on the floor, and you want them to clean it up, and they're not cleaning it up. And so now, because you refuse to do it one time, we're going to sit here and you're going to do it, and you're going to clean it up, and I'm going to pour it back out. You're going to clean it up again, I'm going to pour it back out. You're going to clean it up again, I'm going to pour it back out. And then eventually after, everything happens. I don't want to do it again, so when they clean up, I'm going to clean up. Again, we're talking about some extreme and intense punishers that we've got to consider like whole concerns there, right? Would it make the child then potentially never want to play with Legos? Like, oops, I forgot to pick up a couple Legos and now I have to pick them up. Restitution. So this is actually something that is generally used fairly commonly, so if you've got a client that has severe property destructive behaviors, once they're calm, they have to restore the environment. So they have to go and clean up as a consequence for their destruction. Any questions on those? And I generally wouldn't promote most of these. Contingent exercise, the client is required to engage in an aversive physical activity that is unrelated to the problem behavior, contingent on each instance of problem behavior. So I worked with a client I lived in Denver for a couple of years, and he was at the time 16 or 17, something like that. And we created some behavior contracts for different things that he was struggling with. So he identified some behaviors that he wanted to change. We identified some reinforcement contingencies and some punishment contingencies just to kind of have some added effects. I want to avoid these things and I want these things for completion of good behavior or absence of problem behavior. And one of them was like taking really excessively long showers. He would take very, very long showers in the morning, which caused everyone else to either take cold showers or not be able to shower at all. And so one of the things that so the reinforcement was often like he chose some sort of increased allowance if he did, took an efficient shower. One of his punishers was he had to run a mile with his mom following him. It wasn't really the exercise that bothered him. He was super in shape but he ran a mile with his mom following him, and she could like shout anything she wanted to at him. This was something he totally came up on his own. But still funny, I would also say if you ever become a behavior analyst and you do work with individuals who can kind of identify and design their own behavior contracts, that's the best way to do it. If you've got buy-in from the person that you're working with, it's going to be the most. Guided compliance. So physical prompting or physical requirement of compliance. So if I tell you to pick up all these Legos and you're not doing it, I'm going to stand behind you and grab your hands and we're going to do this until you're doing it on your own. Usually with overcorrection, it starts with this because a lot of times they don't start on their own. And then physical restraint. Client is physically restrained from engaging in their problem behavior. Response blocking, I feel like I don't know. Dr. Arby and I can talk about that one. I'm not entirely sure. That's more, I would consider that extinction than punishment. But, generally speaking, not generally speaking, you would never see physical restraint as a consequence to problem behavior. You would see physical restraint only in like a behavior plan as to maintain safety of self and others. That's the only time that you should really ever be physically restraining somebody by law, so we're clear. Negative punishment, these examples. So timeout. So you've got non-exclusionary. Are they going to go? Who's going to go through this? Okay. Non-exclusionary and exclusionary. Who can tell me what a non-exclusionary timeout? What do you think non-exclusionary timeout is? Take a guess.
You're not by yourself, but you're finding out something else.
Yeah. So like when you're playing a board game with your family and your brother cheats or he says something ugly or whatever, and it's like we're all having a lot of fun, and now you got to go sit over here and just watch us have fun, right? You're not excluded. Whereas exclusionary timeout is when you're off by yourself, right? Like your nose is in the corner across the house, or in some clinics they'll have exclusionary timeout rooms where it's literally just a room that you go into by yourself. Response costs, so that is fines, bonus response costs combined, sometimes combined with positive reinforcement, and sometimes within a group arrangement. So the more y'all dive into behavior analysis, if you are continuing to dive into it, you'll talk about what's called a good behavior game, and that's a group contingency on behavior, and there's usually a group contingency for reinforcement, and sometimes there's also a group response cost. Everybody got that? So timeout from positive reinforcement. That's basically what timeout is, right? If I'm engaging in attention-seeking behaviors and you put me in timeout, I have no longer access to attention, which is what is the positive reinforcement. So with the withdrawal of the opportunity to earn positive reinforcement or the loss of access to reinforcers for a specified period of time. The discrepancy between time out and time in must be great. So there must be, and as in like the value of what it means to be in timeout has to be greater in that moment than the value of being time in, right? So in the punishing value. Does that make sense for it to be effective? Otherwise, they're just going to sit there and be like, I don't really care because I didn't want to play that board game anyway. The loss of access to reinforcement must be contingent on a target behavior. You can't just willy-nilly say, now you're in timeout, now you're this, now you're there. It has to be contingent. Otherwise, you're not going to see change in behavior. We do go through this. Okay. Non-exclusion. So we've got some planned ignoring. So if there's someone in class doing something inappropriate and I have a planned ignoring procedure in place, I'm just going to ignore it until the behavior starts to reduce. Withdrawal of specific positive reinforcer, time with friends, tablet time, phone time, whatever. Contingent observation, a timeout. I'm not entirely sure what a timeout ribbon is actually, but I guess we could make it up. I don't know. I've never heard of that. Exclusionary timeout. So a timeout room, partition timeout, hallway timeout, like we talked about. Really, I'm interested in what timeout ribbon is. Oh man, we're really going. Non-exclusionary timeout. Individual is not completely removed physically from the time in setting. We've got planned ignoring, which is removal of social reinforcement, right? I'm not attending to you. The withdrawal of a specific reinforcer, tangible item is removed. Contingent observation is, here we go, the timeout ribbon. Eligible to earn reinforcers wearing a ribbon or another. Interesting. So contingent observations sit away from the group, but can still see others accessing reinforcers, like I was talking about when you're away from the family playing a board game and having fun. And then the child is eligible to earn reinforcers wearing a ribbon. And so if you lose your ribbon, you're not eligible to earn reinforcers. The timeout room is child sent to a safe but confined space. Or a partition timeout, child remains within the time in setting, but review is restricted. Or a hallway timeout, child is directly to sit in the hallway. That's a lot of times like in a elementary school type setting. Timeout. So there's some pros and cons. There's ease of application. It's pretty easy to apply a timeout procedure. Generally, it's not frowned upon by most people. It's usually pretty accepted. Often, if done effectively, there is suppression of problem behavior. And it's easily combined with other procedures such as differential reinforcement. So when you are reinforcing some sort of response other than the challenging behavior. Cons, you must escort the students to timeout, depending upon the student. It may result in resistance or emotional outbursts, right? How many of us, either when we were children or no children, when put in timeout, will scream and cry for extended periods of time? Access to ongoing instruction. So in a classroom environment, they're going to be missing classroom instruction. Individuals may engage in behavior, self-injury, that should be stopped but go undetected. Often I see one of the most common problem behaviors that I see with timeout is like intentional urination. So they'll wet their pants, so you can't just let them sit there in their urine. So you move on out and you change their clothes. And then sometimes there is a negative public perception, especially if that timeout elicits significant problem behavior. So effective ways to effectively use timeout are using it in the time in environment so that there is a clear differentiation between what they could have versus what they don't have currently. Defining timeout parameters ahead of time, the duration, the exit criteria, exclusion versus non-exclusion timeout. I would say this is the case really for any use of punishment or reinforcement. You should probably always define the parameters before you start if it's appropriate, right? If X happens, Y will be the consequence, whether that's a punisher or a reinforcer. Explain timeout. And also, sorry, just to go back to that, it also, especially if you're working with parents, it helps remove that emotional response. If you're like, okay, when the child hits his brother, this is the consequence. When a child uses terms of frustration and indicating to you that they're frustrated and they don't want to hit their brother, but they feel like they want to hit their brother in that moment, this is the consequence, right? So it's really black and white for parents, because if you are a parent, you know it's really easy to respond emotionally when your child is engaging in problem behavior because you're getting frustrated, versus if you just already have in your head, okay, this happened, I do this. This happened, I do this. It just makes it all a little easier. Explain the timeout rules, obtain permission. Are we going to go through all these? Okay. Apply consistently. Always evaluate the effectiveness. If you're not seeing a decrease in problem behavior, you're doing it for yourself, not for the child or for the person. Consider other or less intrusive options, and consider legal and ethical issues. Like I said, with punishment, you should always really think, like, is this ethical? What trauma could this induce? What challenges could this cause down the road? Response costs. So this is also something that's fairly common, especially for kids that maybe have like a token system or a token board, where, if they engage in X behavior, they lose a token, which makes it longer to access reinforcement. Reduces the future probability of the tolerant behavior. But it should be organized really well. It shouldn't just be subjective. Oh, I think you should lose 3 tokens today. So there's a direct fine. Bonus response cost, the child loses the opportunity for a bonus, or sometimes like in college classes, right? You can sometimes earn extra credit, but if you turn 3 assignments in late or 1 assignment in late, you no longer have the option to earn extra credit. That would be responsible. It works better if you do combine it with positive reinforcement, because that's where learning occurs. It's right here with that word reinforcement. And then group arrangements, if we talk about misbehavior by one student, results in loss of reinforcers by the whole group, which is usually pretty effective because that's that like social punishment that most people want to avoid. Fines should be posed immediately. Response costs versus bonus response costs. Use the least aversive initially. And again, we can't identify which is least aversive for someone, right? That is also individualized. Ensure reinforcement reserve, so decrease the likelihood of bankruptcy. This is they're kind of talking about here. Sometimes we think of like the prison effect, right? When somebody's in prison for a really long time, they start to lose motivation for things because they don't have anything to lose. And so if you've gone bankrupt, whether financially or with other social means or physical goods or whatever the case may be, it starts to lose the value of that reinforcement because you don't even have access to it. Coming in contact with it is really difficult. Be prepared for unplanned and unexpected outcomes. Response costs can reinforce rather than punish undesirable behavior. I had a client once, probably one of the most challenging clients I've ever had. She had reactive attachment disorder, and she engaged in a lot of significant problem behavior, kind of across the board, whatever worked in the moment. And at one point we did try some response costs with her, but what we ultimately determined was that the reason she behaved was for us to respond, like literally respond at all. It didn't matter what we did. So think of like those kid toys, the pop-up toys where you press the button and the door opens. That's like her in real life. Like, I do this because it makes you blink, and I'm going to keep doing this again every time you blink, right? So every time she lost a token, it ramped up that behavior really a lot. So remember, if you plan to be in behavior analysis as a career and you plan to work with individuals with different types of behavioral or learning disabilities, stay on your toes, because you never know what's coming your way. You have no idea what could be going on. So individuals can refuse to give up positive reinforcers. So then having to like physically take something from someone would be really tricky. Avoiding overuse of it, because again, the overuse of it also can reduce its effectiveness. And then always take data. Always, always, always. Everything we do, we should be taking data on, or else we don't know it works. Guidelines for effective use of punishment. So select effective and appropriate punishers. So there are punisher assessments, which seems crazy, but there are reinforcer assessments and punisher assessments. If you don't know that something is aversive, then it's likely not going to be effective. Deliver the punisher at the beginning of the behavioral sequence. Is just going to go down. No, okay. Punish each instance of behavior initially. Gradually shift to an intermittent schedule of punishment. Use mediation with response to punishment delay. Supplement punishment with a complementary intervention. Be prepared for negative side effects. Record, graph, and evaluate daily. Experience the punishment personally and deliver the punishment unemotionally, right? A lot of times when we are talking about like parenting, we should also, like, if we are ever going to use a punishment procedure with a child as a parent or not a parent, we shouldn't be emotional. If you find yourself really frustrated and stressed, it's probably not the right time to do it, because that's likely you're implementing a punishment procedure for you and not for the child. All right, any question on any of those? Okay. Y'all have already gone over this, right? Any thoughts on this? No? I feel like you might have a thought. One of y'all tell me why you think one of y'all advocate for the JRC for any reason.
It's something that can be used every single time. So the likelihood that if you stop the behavior is significantly increased. It's not going to kill the person. It's going to cause some slight discomfort, enough discomfort to where it is going to be effective.
Right. So somebody combat that with an argument.
ethical.
What about the argument that when you have cancer, you get chemo and that causes physical pain?
Behavior that's known about it. Whether like SME, just something areas where close to other people. That would be just where you wanna.
Right, they're also experiencing physical pain there too,
Yeah.
theoretically, maybe, yeah.
So it's almost like 22 in the case of could, whether either way,
Right,
there's going to be pain. It's the die in the hands of someone who else is controlling it or the patient.
anybody else?
Depending on the age of the child, they may not be able to really express how much pain it is, and we can't feel it for them.
Mhm,
So it's like, we may be doing too much,
mhm,
and I mean, we don't know because we can't feel it.
right. Anybody else? Another advocate? And I do this because you should really, so as a behavior analyst, the goal is, if you want to become a behavior analyst, is to be able to think critically and not emotionally about things. And identify what works, but then take the next step, right? So across all sciences, medical sciences, social sciences, we've always identified things that worked. And then subsequently, there have been several things that we identify were like, okay, we knew it would work, but we didn't stop to think, should we do it, right? And that's not in just behavior analysis, that's literally across every field. But that's what, as a behavior analyst, you have to start with, okay, is this effective? Is it functional? Will this help this individual in a way that they can live a more independent and functional life? Is it socially significant for them? Is this intervention going to cause better living outcomes, better quality of life for them? And then, should we do this? What are the long-term side effects, right? And it's the same thing like when someone is diagnosed with cancer and their doctor talks to them about chemo, they're going to talk to you about what are the long-term side effects? What are, all the things, right? And so then you get to decide. The challenge is in this type of situation, a lot of times the individuals in the JRC are not of the capacity to decide for themselves. And so someone else is deciding for them. I will say, and again, I'm not going to go into whether I agree with the JRC or don't agree with the JRC, because honestly, different days of the week, I feel differently about it. In order to go to the JRC, you have to have parent permission, and it's court appointed. So it not only is parent permission, but like you have to sit in front of a judge and a judge say, this is severe enough to warrant this type of intervention. So I will say there are some safeguards, but one of the biggest challenges, in my opinion, beyond the fact that, my concern is like after they graduate, would behavior come back? One of the things that they do there that often no one talks about is the fact that there is a lot of reinforcement and there is a lot of teaching. So they are teaching alternative behaviors. The concern is it is handled by humans. And if you hire someone who looks great on paper, but is a really sick soul and wants to just shock people, right? Like there are checks and balances, but things happen, right? Things definitely happen. So, I don't know. It's a tricky one for sure when we're talking about individuals who are punching themselves so hard that they're causing blindness or ramming their head into cement blocks and causing serious brain damage. When parents are looking and saying, I don't know what else to do, it is tricky.
Could there be a level of debriefing so that there is no PTSD or long trauma or effect from the treatment involved?
I don't know. I don't really even know who could even decide that would be, right? Like, you would always, I know in my practice and when I practice, like even physical restraint, we have a significant level of debriefing just from physical restraint. So I would be shocked that if they didn't use some sort of debriefing. Yeah, sorry. I would be very surprised if they didn't use some level of debriefing. However, again, to know whether that would be effective at reducing traumatic effects and PTSD, I would lean on the side of probably not.
I was just gonna say it also depends on the person, everybody handles things differently, where some might have a lesser form of the treatment, would still get PTSD versus someone who might have it every 5 minutes or something.
I don't know. It's definitely, I mean, it's controversial, and I think it warrants a non-judgmental conversation, in the sense of, let's really talk through this and identify, okay, if not there, which is a totally fine argument, where, right? What is better? Where do the technologies exist? There are some newer treatments in behavior analysis. If any of y'all are interested, you should look into Greg Hanley's research in his lab. He does a lot. He works up at the New England Center for Children. And he works with severe maladaptive behavior and working through how to change it and suppress it so that other things can be learned in its place. But I think I would encourage you all to think about things like this without, not to be cold, but without as much emotion and judgment, and think about everyone here, everyone in that realm is looking to help. And we just need to think critically about, is there a place for this? If the answer is no, that's okay. But if the answer is yes, when, where, how, why, who, right? Like, what are the exceptions? For a long time, there was someone in the state of Tennessee that, for severe punishment in the state of Tennessee, you have to go through a whole board for approval. And someone in the state of Tennessee used shock. He was a very large man who was very self-injurious and very aggressive towards others. And for anyone to help him with anything, any type of daily living activity, cleansing, teeth brushing, hand washing, taking medication, they incurred severe injury because he's such a big guy and such a strong guy. And so they did use shock. The last I was told about it, which was probably 5 years ago, he was at a point where he had like a pseudo device on him. It didn't have the capacity to deliver shock, but that was needed in order to keep suppression of behavior down. They had tried without it. And so then you get into, is that okay? What's the other end? Keep them in a padded room all the time and toss food under, what's the answer? I don't know. I would love it if one of y'all did. And then the ethics to punishment. So like we've talked about a lot, there's definitely some ethical concerns and some things to consider. What is informed consent, right? Is it only the informed consent of the adult or guardian, or do we have to have informed consent from the individual? Legally, we don't have to have informed consent from the individual if they're under 18 or in a conservatorship or something along those lines. What are the alternative treatments? If you're a behavior analyst, our ethical code says we have to exhaust all forms of reinforcement before we can go. Is it safe? How severe is the problem behavior? Is there like life-threatening problem behavior that we need to see? Because reinforcement takes time. That's the reality of it. It takes a long time sometimes. Whereas punishment, if it's effective, you'll see an immediate stop, or pretty immediate stop. And so sometimes the severity of the problem behavior, like I said, an individual running full speed with their head into a concrete wall, that, we need to stop that quickly. They could kill themselves. What are the guidelines to do this? How much training do I have? What supervision do I have? Who's keeping me in check, making sure that all these things, all of my I's are dotted and all my T's are crossed? What is the peer review process here? And then, is there an accountability system in place for me? Any questions? Nope. Okay. Well, thank y'all for letting me teach you today. Brought back a decade ago experience that I had teaching undergrad. Y'all are all undergrad, right? And have a good day. So happy Friday Eve. Thank you. Yeah.
So obviously, I'm like just about to be started. And also, I know I think I don't know the word I was controlling. So that happens the next one. But I listen. That's not my problem. Anyway, I'm about to be just.
Let me stop this.
Yeah.
Oh, there was a chat. Oh. The timeout, remember? Vince, what's your question? You're welcome. Sorry, I'm not ignoring y'all.
Sorry, I didn't want to chime in. I mean, they can.
you
They
there?
can talk if they want to go first. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, either way. Go ahead, Spence.
One of the things I wanted to talk about was the aversive shock therapy.
Mhm.
I can kind of see the pros and cons on both of them. But also, wouldn't you have to maintain that shock or some variation of it for a long time, because there'd be just a rapid decay in them kind of listening and doing what they're supposed to do, the patient or participant, whatever you want to refer to them as, because without that shock, the behavior would essentially just revert back to its old way at a pretty steady rate, probably a fast rate, I imagine.
Yeah, I would say if the punishment was delivered in isolation without any teaching of some other alternative response that accessed the same consequence, right? So like, if I delivered shock due to non-compliance because I wanted to escape whatever work task had been provided to me, and instead of saying like, hey, can I have 20 minutes to go, like, I don't know, eat a snack or whatever the case may be, instead of like tossing the work activity and engaging in other maladaptive behavior, if that response occurred, then likely reinforcement would follow, and that would get the same consequence, right, to engaging in problem behavior to avoid the task. And so the goal, and the reality is the goal would be that there would be simultaneous teaching to the punishment. By no means am I here advocating for it. I just think that there's lots of things to consider and to think about.
Right.
But yes, if the punishment was used completely in isolation without teaching procedures simultaneously, you would likely see a resurgence of the challenging behavior. Because individuals have to find a way to communicate something. And problem behavior is just communication. It's just, we've got to figure out what is being communicated and how can we teach someone to communicate this in a way that's functional and that doesn't cause challenges to themselves or others.
Okay. And last question here. So
Yeah.
we discussed essentially the weight or value that one values a punishment or a reward, for that matter, earlier. And I was curious how you as a researcher would actually be able to determine that. Are you going off of subjective observations that you've made on, yes, they really enjoy this? Are you going off of surveys, questionnaires of like, yes, they really enjoy this?
Yeah, that's gonna be somewhat individualized. It would depend on like the level of ability to communicate by the client or